the side of me is the world's smallest Ryzen 7 7840U powered 1080p handheld gaming system. So let this be a lesson to all of you that you too can be the best in the world of something so long as you add enough adjectives. Welcome back to Craft Computing, everyone. As always, I'm Jeff. Like I mentioned, today we're going to be taking a look at the all-new OneXFly from OneXPlayer, touted as the world's smallest Ryzen 7840U handheld device, which is a record I'm sure will stand for at least a month. What we're looking at, hyperbole aside, is what happens in an industry when you actually turn the competition up to 11. With Valve and more recently Asus jumping into the space previously dominated by the likes of GPD, Aya Neo, and OneXPlayer, it's time you either bring your A game or go sit on the sidelines. And the OneXFly feels like OneXPlayer's A game, packing an AMD Ryzen 7 7840U mobile APU, an 8-core 16-threaded Zen 4 monster alongside the Radeon 780M RDNA 3-powered graphics chip. The 16GB of dual-channel DDR5 memory has been turned all the way up to 7500 MTS, making it one of the fastest memory configurations that you can buy today. All of that is designed to fit in the palm of your hand and drive a 7-inch 1080p 120Hz IPS display for the ultimate in portable gaming bliss. Compared to the Steam Deck, which I have right here, it makes it clear how unpocketable Valve's handheld device really is. At only around 2/3 the size, it manages to pack the same size display along with all of that power and even a larger battery to boot. That larger battery will come in handy for more than one reason, as unlike the Steam Deck and its paltry 15-watt max TDP, you can crank the OneXFly all the way up to 30 watts of power, getting near desktop levels of performance out of the CPU and mobile graphics normally reserved for dedicated gaming laptops. Full disclosure before we get into the section of the video with my opinions in it, OneXPlayer did send me out this prototype of the OneXFly for my review. Like all reviews on the channel, no money changed hands, OneXPlayer gets no editorial control over the content of this video, nor will they have an opportunity to see this video before you do. And as an extra special disclaimer, as this is a prototype unit, please keep in mind that OneXPlayer is currently running a crowdfunding campaign for the OneXFly on Indiegogo. The handheld itself, pricing, availability, configurations, or even minor specs may change before launch, so do keep that in mind. While I understand that this is a prototype, I will include all criticisms I have in this review. So, can you trust me? Honestly, I don't trust me half the time. All I can do is deliver my opinions, and it's up to you what to do with them. There's also one very special thing of note on the OneXFly prototype, and that is the screen has not been enabled to go to 120 Hz yet. My prototype unit is locked at 60 Hz max. While I will give some opinions around the screen, I don't even know if this is the final panel, and I know it is not the final configuration or settings that you will be receiving in a retail unit. So, with all that, let's get into it. Let's go ahead and start with ergonomics, as I feel that's one of the most important aspects of a handheld gaming device. If it's not comfortable, you're not going to use it, regardless of how good the internal specs may be. Luckily, the OneXFly is among the most comfortable handhelds that I've ever used. It is significantly thicker than the Steam Deck, but it's just as natural in my hands. My thumbs naturally land on the face controls, whether they be the joysticks, ABXY, or the D-pad, and the start and select buttons are perfectly placed, so hitting them doesn't require any adjusting of my grip. The joysticks are light and snappy with a decent amount of travel. They're also backed by Hall effect sensors to prevent stick drift and improve accuracy with a smaller dead zone. The same can be said of the analog triggers, which also use Hall effect sensors. My one complaint around ergonomics is actually around the shoulder buttons, as I found they were a little bit too far forward on top of the device. I'm a single finger player between the shoulder and the trigger buttons, and it was actually difficult to hit the shoulder buttons without adjusting my grip or straining my hand slightly. The shoulder buttons are also quite long on this device, and the buttons themselves are towards the outside edge of the device. When my fingers eventually do make contact with the shoulder button, it causes it to be a much shallower travel and actually a much firmer click, making it even more difficult to firmly press that button in. To be clear, this is not a huge problem, and it really does come down to my preferred grip style, but I felt it was worth noting. Adjusting to hit the shoulder buttons higher up on my finger and more to the side does make it much easier to press, and it really depends on how ingrained your muscle memory is. As for the rest of the controls, the ABXY and D-pad both feel excellent. In fact, they're among the best in a gaming handheld that I've felt. And the D-pad is easily able to roll underneath your thumb while still providing feedback as to which direction you're actually pressing. There are some hotkeys on the OneXFly as well, with 2 programmable shoulder buttons on top, as well as a dedicated Show Desktop button to the left of your screen, as well as hotkeys for the One X control panel and on-screen keyboard along the right side. Despite my complaints around the shoulder buttons, this is still among the most comfortable handhelds I've had the pleasure of reviewing. In fact, in a recent 8-hour cross-continent plane ride, I saw nearly 5 hours of use in a single sitting on the OneXFly with no hand fatigue at all when I was done playing. Pretty impressive. If there's one major hindrance to devices like this, believe it or not, I think it's Windows. Obviously, every handheld review needs to pay homage to the Steam Deck for bringing the form factor into the mainstream, but Valve did more than provide a baseline for hardware. It showed off the weaknesses within Windows as a mobile operating system. Everything from the on-screen keyboard to GUI design based around mouse navigation to just starting and running applications, Windows is a hot mess. What it has going for it in game compatibility, it loses when it comes to user interface and, more importantly, overall user experience. Now, don't misunderstand me. Shipping Windows on a device isn't inherently a bad thing, nor am I here to be some Linux evangelist. But that also means that the shortfalls of Windows as a platform are going to fall squarely on the company for user experience, something companies like OneXPlayer and Neo have attempted to solve before. In the case of OneXPlayer, there's the OneX Launcher, which can scan your game library and import your games, providing a one-click launcher interface. Unfortunately, there's no way to install your games from that launcher, so you're still going to need to install Steam, Epic, GOG, or whatever your client of choice is, then install the games as if this were a full-fat PC. Only, there's a couple things missing that prevent the experience from being easy. For starters, you don't have a mouse, and as I already mentioned, almost all Windows software has terrible GUI design that doesn't make a lot of sense when using a touchscreen. But why don't you just install Linux or Chimera or Arch or Pop or... I've heard you screaming the entire last segment, and trust me, I actually tried, but there's a couple things keeping Linux from working properly too on the OneXFly. While Chimera OS has made some great strides bringing SteamOS support to generic Arch distros, it's missing a couple very key features when it comes to handhelds. Specifically, how do you go through developing an operating system designed for running on handheld hardware and mobile screens and not build a screen rotation function into the GUI? I installed Chimera, checked for drivers and function, and everything worked perfectly. Touchscreen, Wi-Fi, speakers, controller. It's just my screen was stuck upside down. And there were a dozen forum threads all around this issue, all of which disagreed on either how to fix it or if it even was a fixable issue. In the end, I couldn't rotate the screen, which makes it kind of pointless to install on a handheld device. I also installed Zorin OS, an Ubuntu Debian-based distro that I've used many times for Linux gaming installs. And I actually ran into the exact same problem with screen rotation. While Zorin at least had a menu option to rotate the display, actually changing the setting didn't actually change the setting. And even if I got SteamOS or Chimera or Zorin installed onto this handheld, we come back to my previous complaint about the hotkeys. Even if those operating systems worked perfectly right out of the box and all of your devices functioned properly, I still can't bring up the SteamOS menu items or the context menu to adjust in-game settings, adjust TDP, or even exit a damn game. It would be pointless to install it onto a handheld and then not be able to use it. Lastly, I want to touch on something that's been aggravating not only the handheld community, but a number of mini PC and embedded system products for years, and that's driver support from AMD around both chipsets and graphics drivers. AMD decided somewhere along the way with their APU systems to put the burden of developing drivers on system integrators. That is, the companies like OneXPlayer, Neo, Minis Forum, etc., who are building devices with their CPUs, their graphics devices, and their chipsets. AMD's justification for this is potentially tighter integration with things like TDP controls, memory speed, and allocation, or other loose benefits that companies might have for building device drivers in-house. The problem occurs when these companies stop developing device drivers for these devices, and you're unable to go to AMD to get updates. My OneXFly shipped with AMD Adrenalin 22.4.64 from May 31st of 2023. A full 3 months have gone by, and AMD is now shipping device driver 23.8 for the same Ryzen 7840U and 780M graphics device. But you can't download the drivers from AMD to get an update for them. Instead, OneXPlayer has to receive the updates from AMD and then recompile them for each device that they make, which means if you buy a OneXFly or a GPD WinMax 2 or an Aya Neo 2, you're beholden to these companies for updates because AMD doesn't want to put the time into their own device drivers or device integrations. Running both AMD's automatic driver installer and downloading the latest Adrenalin package for the AMD 7840U resulted in errors during installation, preventing the update from installing. That also means I'm not going to receive updated drivers or optimizations for the latest games, like Starfield, which tells me every time that I launch the game that my graphics drivers are out of date. With the drivers that shipped with the OneXFly, I was able to play Starfield for around 40 minutes. But then, every time I launched a save game, it ran for about 30 seconds and then hard crashed. I also had nearly instant crashing when changing any of the in-game settings, probably a memory allocation issue, which probably could be fixed with a driver update. But, yeah. Now, while OneXPlayer themselves haven't released updated graphics drivers on their website for a console that is still in its crowdfunding stage, Aya Neo has posted Starfield-ready drivers for the Aya Neo 2S, another handheld powered by the same Ryzen 7840U and AMD 780M graphics. While the installer still wasn't entirely happy to be running on the OneXFly, and Adrenalin itself didn't upgrade all the way, the graphics drivers themselves are now on version 23.8.2. As such, I was actually able to get some gameplay footage of Starfield running, at a couple different TDP settings even. But we'll get into the performance section of this video shortly. Now, pretty much everything that I've been talking about, from Windows and GUI issues, to hotkeys, to driver support, to Linux integration, isn't a problem with just the OneXPlayer or the OneXFly, and is totally a problem that AMD has more than enough resources to fix in-house if they chose to. They're just wanting to farm out integration of some of their power management features to third parties using their parts, rather than tackling the problem head-on themselves. So why am I bringing this up? Because this is a problem that AMD needs to fix. It should not be up to OEMs to produce game-ready drivers for their own handhelds. That's not how this industry works when it comes to graphics card solutions, and no offense to GPD, OneXPlayer, Aya Neo, or even Asus, but maybe AMD's channel partners aren't as well equipped to develop graphics drivers as AMD is in-house. Now obviously, I went through a number of different OS installs during my testing of the OneXFly. And typically, I won't do that until after I've done my initial product testing and initial benchmarking. But as I was going to be traveling pretty much the entirety of time that I was testing this, I wanted to see if something like Chimera might be a little bit more travel-friendly. Turns out, unless you live in Australia, it's probably not the best solution for the OneXFly until they implement screen rotation. But that also means that I got to test out OneXPlayer's driver installers inside of Windows, and that wasn't without its own issues either, specifically because I wanted to run Windows 11 Professional for workstations, which is the most debloated version of Windows that's out there. I've previously done a video on that if you want to check that out here. Even though all of the drivers and devices and auto installs and software went off without a hitch, running Windows 11 Pro for Workstation actually broke the touch keyboard, that is the tablet-style keyboard for Windows. It meant that the little hotkey down here for launching the keyboard started launching the accessibility keyboard, which is typically driven by a mouse and doesn't have any of the touch input features that we're all used to that actually make it usable on a screen this size. Also, we can take this opportunity to go back to my previous complaint about not being able to go to AMD to install chipset drivers or graphics drivers or even just basic software or AMD Adrenalin direct from AMD's website, instead having to use the 3 or 4 month outdated package direct from OneXPlayer. AMD may support the Ryzen 7 7840U for the next 4 or 5 years, But if OneXPlayer decides to cease updates, you're the one that's going to be out of luck. And given the frequency at which companies are releasing handhelds now, and based on history over just the last couple years, I'd be willing to bet driver updates are going to be few and far between for just about every handheld device that's out there. But enough about AMD's internal issues that are affecting you aside, let's get into the performance of the OneXFly. Now, I didn't go into my full standard in-depth benchmarking in this video, as I promised OneXPlayer I'd have this one out before the end of their crowdfunding campaign, which ends in just a couple more days. But I did capture gameplay footage from a number of demanding titles, both at 18 watts and 30 watt TDP, to give you an idea of what performance you can expect. And it's not that I think full benchmarking isn't important for handhelds, but when you're crammed on an airplane, performance is less important than overall experience and battery life. And for the most part, my testing of the OneXFly took place on planes this last month, and that's the experience that I'm going to report on. We'll go ahead and start with the one game that I didn't play on a plane, and that's Bethesda's latest open-world RPG, which dropped just a couple days ago. And let me tell you, I am already hooked on Starfield. While I alluded to issues of getting Starfield up and running earlier in this video, once I managed to install updated drivers, the experience was nearly flawless. Of course, we are running at 1080p low settings and with FSR2 enabled, but the game runs, and actually runs quite well. Planets on the barren side of things seem to have no trouble averaging around 45 FPS, even during combat. And in my 6 or so hours of playing on the device, that's where most of the combat that I encountered took place. Bumping up to 30 watts on the TDP, we managed just shy of 60 FPS, settling in right around 57 most of the time. At either TDP setting in this environment, I didn't notice any stutters or performance issues that took me out of enjoying the game. In more densely populated areas, like New Atlantis, performance definitely takes a hit, especially at 18 watts, with it barely able to hold 30 FPS most of the time, even dropping down into the low 20s. That's fine for exploration, but not ideal for combat. Bumping the TDP up to 30 watts does see us hold above 30 FPS more often than not, even hitting into the mid to low 40s. In cities, performance drops and stutters do occur far more often, as we have a lot more assets loading in and out, and AI doing their thing around the city. Starfield is definitely playable on the OneXFly, which is nice to say after the swath of handhelds that debuted with Cyberpunk 2077 over every single advertisement and product page, only to manage 20 FPS on average at 720p and low settings. It's not perfect, and there's going to be some areas of the game that do struggle more than others, but there was nothing that made me put it down during my testing. Speaking of the Dark Souls of PC benchmarking, let's fire up Cyberpunk and see how it fares on the Radeon 780M. Again, we're running at 18 watt TDP, 1080p low settings, but this time with dynamic resolution and upscale tech turned off. And the OneXFly does struggle a bit here. Although, keep in mind, even though we managed to barely hit 30 FPS on average, most handhelds I've tested to this point struggle to hit 25 FPS on average, and that's at just 720p. Now, while 30 FPS is great for walking around Night City and taking in the sights, it's less great for headshotting some gonk with a pistol. But we do have ways of increasing performance, and enabling FSR in performance mode is a great starting point, as that jumps us up to around 42 FPS on average, making the game infinitely more playable. Even more of note was, even when reviewing the footage, I couldn't find any notable visual artifacts with FSR enabled, which means you're never going to find them when playing the game in real time on a 7-inch display. Lastly, I turned up the TDP to 30 watts and was rewarded with between 48 and 52 FPS on average, with no noticeable dips, even while getting my ass kicked in combat. While it does take some grunt and a whole lot of power, Cyberpunk is totally playable. Tiny Tina's Wonderlands is a game that I have very high hope for on this console, as it's been one of my favorite games to play over the last year. Starting off yet again, we are at 1080p low settings with FSR disabled and at 18 watt TDP on the OneXFly. This is a game that can be a bit stuttery on lower end hardware, and I've been really curious to see how the 7840U would handle it. In a typical combat arena, I see frame rate fluctuate from between 35 and 48 FPS on average, which is definitely a solid result at 1080p. Overall, the game was very playable at this setting and power level, and as I've said in numerous handheld reviews, I'll take battery life over bleeding edge performance any day of the week, but especially on a 5-hour plane ride. Enabling FSR2 in performance mode and 0.5 sharpening, the same setting that I used in Cyberpunk, we immediately go from middling 30s to between 60 and 75 FPS on average. Gameplay was as smooth and fluid as I've ever seen it on a handheld. And as a reminder, this is still at the 18-watt TDP setting. That being said, I didn't bother turning up the wick on this game as I was already extremely satisfied with those performance results. Red Dead Redemption 2 is going to be an interesting one to talk about, because I know this game plays wonderfully on similar hardware or previous generation Ryzen chips like the 6800U. But this game does have some quirks when setting screen resolutions on displays that are not natively landscape. Sometimes the game will launch and run just fine. Other times you're going to get a window roughly 1/4 to 1/3 the screen, and unfortunately, that's what we got here today. If you know of a fix for this, I'd love to hear it, because this is an issue that I've ran into on a couple different handhelds now. Basically, in Red Dead Redemption 2, in windowed or borderless modes, it will only set 4:3 resolutions up to 1024x768. And I believe that's because the horizontal resolution on a portrait display that's rotated into landscape is 1080. So the max resolution it thinks it can go to is 1024 on that same horizontal spread. Telling the game to go full screen allows you to select 1920x1080, but for some reason this game hates to actually create a full screen render and will instead shrink down to the corner of your display. Playable from a performance standpoint? Absolutely. Playable from a you'll be happy as a user standpoint? That's a bit more debatable. As I said, I've ran into this issue on a couple different handhelds, and I decided just to save my sanity this time and move on. Another title that ran exceedingly well at just 18 watts of power was Wreckfest. Running at 1080p and this time medium presets across the board, the Destruction Derby sim did show a tendency to slow down a bit in crowded areas. And by slow down, I mean only 70 FPS. Most of the time, we were cruising closer to 100 or 110 FPS, with nothing but my own lack of skill slowing me down. This game in particular shows just how far performance has come in the last couple of years with certain types of hardware, as it wasn't that long ago that mid-tier GPUs struggled with this game at 1080p. Granted, that was at high settings, but I just want to clarify, there were no tricks here. This was 1080p medium settings and just 18 watts of total system power with no FSR, upscaling, or other tech integrated into it, and we were getting nearly 100 FPS. Pretty impressive to say the least. Rounding us off is Project Cars 3, also running at 1080p and medium presets at just 18 watts of power. Yet again, I'm kind of blown away by the performance we got here, averaging somewhere between 65 and 75 FPS, depending on the area of the track that you're on. But not everything is rosy in this title, as I did notice quite a few graphical issues during gameplay. When I was testing out different settings, I noticed even on the main menu that low settings caused texture and lighting issues on the car on screen. Bumping back to the medium preset made this problem go away, and is ultimately the setting that I tested at. Distant trees and objects kept having problems of figuring out if they were supposed to be in front of or behind other trees and background objects, something I haven't noticed in previous benchmark runs on this game, and I've run this track a lot. Lastly, there were a couple moments on the track where, just like in the main menu, textures and lighting would suddenly start flickering on certain objects. This was most prominent on the track wall after turn 2. It's nothing terribly game-breaking, but it's something the drivers on the 7840U should probably address at some point. If only AMD were keeping tabs on things like this for the hardware that they sold. Now I know it sounds like I'm pretty down on the OneXFly here outside of ergonomics and performance, but the truth of the matter is I'm actually a huge fan of this console. But most of the issues that plague gaming handhelds as a whole are on full display here, whether it be Windows issues or AMD driver issues. I also feel it's important to clarify my position here. I'm not a Linux evangelical. I'm not saying just install Linux and ignore all the problems that come with it and all your problems will go away. I still run Windows on both of my desktops fully by choice here. While I do have Linux on my daily driver laptop, it also dual boots Windows for when I need to actually do work with it. But Windows is designed for a certain type of user interface. That is, it expects the user to have a keyboard and a mouse. Take both of those away, or severely cripple the way they work in the OS, and it becomes rife with problems. While companies like OneXPlayer are attempting to come up with their own game launchers and improve that user experience, those only really do anything meaningful after the games have been installed, and it's still up to the user to get that far. Even if Windows is going to remain the OS of choice for these manufacturers, Steam's Big Picture mode, or a similar top-to-bottom shell replacement, needs to be implemented to create a console-like experience for the customer, and the One X launcher ain't it. Adding button support for Steam menus would be a great start, as the hardware is already right there. You can just change the way it works, or allow the user to decide which way it works depending on which operating system or shell they want to use. And it would close the gap on usability between Windows handhelds and the Steam Deck. Again, I'm really not down on the OneXFly as it exists in this marketplace today. It's just, again, it kind of exemplifies everything that every other handheld is going to complain about. This will likely replace my Aya Neo Next as my daily driver handheld, and likely become my new carry-on companion for flying. The overall form factor, ergonomics, and screen size are an absolute winner. Dual USB-C ports with full connectivity means charging at 65 watts and outputting to HDMI, or better yet, pairing with a set of X-Real Air glasses means you can use the device for as long as you have power to it. The 1080p screen is an absolute thing of beauty, even though I didn't get to try it out at 120 Hz. That's going to have to wait until the full retail version. The controls and ergonomics are top of their class, and it is priced to compete with the Asus ROG Ally in a slightly lighter and smaller form factor. Like all things in crowdfunding, take pricing with a grain of salt, as I don't think either early bird or full retail pricing will be the final street price on these units. But for a OneXFly with a Ryzen 7840U, 16GB of LPDDR5 7500, and a 512GB NVMe drive, $739 is an amazing price point, sitting just above the ROG Ally at $699. The Ryzen Z1 is only around 4 to 6% faster than the unmodified 7840U around which it's based, and the OneXFly comes with superior controls with Hall effect triggers and joysticks, along with a pair of USB-C ports if you run a set of AR glasses. If you're interested in picking up one for yourself, make sure to follow the link down in the video description, but please do remember, this is still crowdfunding. On your way down there, make sure to drop this video a like and subscribe to Craft Computing if you haven't done so already. Follow me on the social medias at Craft Computing for daily shenanigans like this. And if you like the content you see on this channel and want to help support me in what I do, please head on over to craftcomputing.store and pick up some merch. It is literally the best way to help support the channel. That's going to do for me in this one. Thank you all so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys, and leave that one alone. The beer for today is a cocktail-inspired fusion from Lagunita's Brewing. It is the Tiki Fusion, based on a zombie cocktail, but this is in IPA form. It's a hazy IPA with notes of allspice, orange, lime, and grapefruit, clocking in at a whopping 10%. A lot of grapefruit right on the nose. For those that don't know the origins of the zombie cocktail, it's actually one of the original tiki bar cocktails actually made in America. This was originally created by Donn Beach in Hollywood, California for the first Polynesian-themed tiki bar. So when you're talking about tiki cocktails, this is kind of one of the OGs. Typically, you're going to make this with a light rum, a dark rum, and a 151 rum, very similar to a traditional Mai Tai. But in this case, you also add pineapple juice, a little bit of lime. You can do grapefruit, you can do orange. Really, it's kind of just a mashup of all things citrus and a lot of rum. I'm going to need some time on this one. I don't know that I like it. So like I said, there's a lot of grapefruit right on the nose. And really, that's about all I smell. This smells like Squirt or Fresca or, you know, a grapefruit style soda. What follows can only be described as hollow. It hits your tongue, you get a wave of grapefruit, and then a whole lot of nothing in the middle. It's just this dry, lifeless, amorphous blob. And then what leaves you is, honestly, what does taste like a little bit of Angostura bitters, a little bit of cinnamon and allspice and things like that. But there's nothing else there. It is the weirdest thing I've ever drank out of a beer. And then the flavor that it leaves you with tastes like bad oranges. That is just not a good flavor at the back end. But no, it was grapefruit soda, grapefruit soda, gone. Angostura, rotten fruit. I don't know that I'm going to be able to drink this one. That is just not a good flavor. Yep, that's all I can do with it. There's nothing else there. There's nothing redeeming about it. I don't do this often on the channel, but Lagunita's Tiki Fusion Zombie Cocktail-Inspired IPA. That's just awful. Leave this one on the shelf. No, stop drinking that. It's disgusting.